After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was the Sabbath.
This is the word of the Lord. I suppose in a preaching class I would be told to come up with a snappy line to start, but I'm not going to do that this morning. If you don't remember anything I say today, I pray that what Greg's saying, that we would never forget the wonder of God's mercy. Seems to be incredibly fitting today. May that be your theme, both here and as you leave this place, that we live and worship a merciful God who loves us not because of who we are, but he loves us because we're created in his image, and he loves us in spite of who we are at times. That's what mercy is about. This passage takes place, this story takes place in John chapter 5 at a place called Bethzatha. In English, we would say Bethesda, similar to the hospital in Maryland. The house of mercy is what it means. House of mercy. And Jesus goes to this place and heals a man who had been paralyzed for many years. And we think about Jesus, the transformer, the one who comes and changes us, the one who comes and shows us mercy. I want to teach you today about a God who was born with a divine father and a human mother. I want to teach you this morning again about a God who came to earth and healed. I want to teach you about a God who, even though he was killed, was raised from the dead. I want to remind you, and I want to teach you about that God this morning. Of course, help me out on the count of 3. His name is 1, 2, 3, Asclepius. Wait a second. Asclepius. The god Asclepius was made a god in about 500 BCE. If we have a picture of him right now to show up on the screen, I think, the god Asclepius was born, right? He was the son of Apollo and a human woman. Coronis was his mother's name. His mother was killed for being unfaithful to Apollo, and while she was pregnant with Asclepius and put on the funeral pyre, Apollo came down and rescued his son. He gave him to a centaur to be raised, and there he learned the art of medicine. He learned the art of medicine, and then later on, as he was growing up, a snake came up to him, and instead of killing him, Asclepius helped the snake. And the snake, in Greek tradition, licked his ear and taught him the secrets of medicine. To the Greeks, snakes were sacred beings of wisdom, healing, and even resurrection. I mean, when we think about it, the snake is the ultimate symbol of resurrection in the ancient world, because as the snakes would go, they would shed their skin, and from that would emerge a new snake. And of course, we have scientific reasons for that, but in the ancient world, it gave a picture of death and resurrection. And so Asclepius not only became the god of healing, but he became the god of resurrection in the ancient Greek world. He became so proficient of a healer that he surpassed all the other Greek gods, including Apollo. He was able to evade death himself and began to raise others from the dead. Hades, the brother of Zeus, was nervous about Asclepius and said, well, wait a second, if he keeps raising people from the dead, then there's not going to be any souls left for me in Hades. And so Zeus took a thunderbolt and struck down Asclepius and killed him. Oh, but just a few short days later, at least according to some accounts, Asclepius was raised from the dead. And so a God who heals, a God who has a divine father and a human mother, who heals, has the power to heal, who has the power even to resurrect people from the dead, and who himself was resurrected from the dead. He became an important figure in the Greek world. Not just this God, you can see that he becomes the father today of modern medicine. Right? His children were named his children were named after or given names that today modern medicine still uses. His symbol, if you can see it, is the staff with the snake around it, which physicians still kind of use as a symbol for their guild. He is the God of healing, and the ideas of Asclepius still work through modern medicine. But it wasn't just the God, but Asclepius was also worshipped at a place called an Asclepion, a temple, and it became a temple for healing. If we look at the next slide, this is the Asclepion in Pergamum. In Pergamum, if you were sick, you would go to Pergamum, or if you lived anywhere in Turkey, you would go to Pergamum, you would walk that kilometer colonnaded street, and there you would enter the temple of Asclepion, and you would go there to be healed. Go ahead and let's see the next picture. You can see on one of those, or on almost all of those columns, that's a close-up picture, you can see the snakes and the pictures of healing that would happen. People who had ailments for a long time would go to the Asclepion, save up a large sum of money, and finally hope to be healed. Go ahead. You would then go underground into like the bowels of the earth, symbolizing going in to kind of death in the ground and then coming out to new life. They would give you like all sorts of, a priest there would give you things to do, and that thing might include exercise or mud baths. Sometimes they would give you opium to kind of get you in a dream-like state. And to be honest, the success rate for healing at the Asclepion was good. People were healed there. And if you were healed, you were required, or at least encouraged, to either write your name on a white piece of stone, or you would create a cast of your body part that was broken and now healed, and it would be made new. And you would offer that to Asclepius. Go ahead, let's see the next slide. There you can see down underneath in these tunnels, envision people, envision also snakes, non-poisonous snakes that they would let crawl over you. I would not have been healed because I would have been running from that place 1,000 miles an hour. But you had snakes and opium and so much that the priest got nervous that people weren't really sick, but they were just coming for the opium, right? Now, so what they said was, you can only come 3 times. And after that, you have to understand that Asclepius has decided that he's not going to heal you, right? Remember, Paul had an ailment. And he said, I prayed 3 times that God would take this from me. But he didn't. Now, you can make an argument that Paul is just using an Asclepian-type image to talk about praying to God, or it's possible that Paul went to the Asclepion. Right? No, Paul wouldn't have gone to the Asclepion. I think Paul would have gone to the Asclepion, right? When our children are sick, we care about the doctor's genius, not about his or her faith background initially, right? I mean, you bring your kid into the emergency room, you don't hand them a questionnaire that says, what's your faith? And Paul, later in Corinthians, is like, it doesn't matter. Go eat meat sacrificed to idols. It doesn't matter. They're not real. Paul didn't believe that Asclepius was going to heal him, but maybe the medicine provided at the Asclepion would heal him. Either way, Paul is familiar with these traditions. Next slide here. Here we see, again, one of those columns, but we also see on your right is a bathing pool. Because one of the things that you had to do before you could go underground was enter into this pool to be ritually cleansed. And so the god Asclepius was one who demanded ritual purification, who then you would offer him gifts, and you would go there, and if God was willing, the god Asclepius, he would heal you. And if he wasn't, you weren't healed. And for some of us, I mean, it's an interesting history lesson, but let me take you to Jerusalem. Go ahead, the next slide. In Jerusalem, I know that just looks like a pile of rocks, but because it's a pile of rocks. But what you're looking at is what archaeologists believe are the pools of Bethesda. For some of you who have been to Jerusalem, remember, this is the place right outside of St. Anne's Church where people will usually sing. And there, I mean, what you have there is the pools of Bethesda, which has been overtaken by, Hadrian built things there, and then the Crusaders built things there, and then the the Muslims who conquered the area built things there, and now today it's an archaeological site. So, but at the base level of that place is the pools of Bethesda. Here's the next slide is an artist reconstruction of what that would have looked like. You would enter into the sheep gate, and which is one of the main gates that you would enter through the temple to go to the temple, and you'd enter into the old city of Jerusalem, and there, I mean, it makes sense, just like if you see homeless people or people who need help stand on busy street corners or at entrances to places, that's what the pools of Bethesda served. They were a place where the people who were sick and who were invalids or who were poor and needed money would sit at the pools of Bethesda, because as people would enter to go be religious at the temple, maybe their hearts were open to help. And this is where Jesus heals the man who is paralyzed. But what most of us don't know is that this was a temple to Asclepius. The pools of Bethesda was an Asclepion. It was a place where people would go and they would look for the Greek god to be healed. We know that Asclepius was worshipped in Jerusalem, and he was worshipped at the pools of Bethesda. Jesus goes there. There were plenty of other places that Jesus could have gone and healed a paralytic. There are plenty of other places that Jesus could have done a miracle like this to show his power, but he chooses to go to the Asclepion to heal. And in doing so, he made some pretty important statements. First, I think God is teaching the people there, and he's teaching us today, that he is the true healer. He is the true healer. He walked into the Asclepion, and this is interesting, that the church throughout its history actually tried to hide the fact that this was an Asclepion. For some reason, they didn't think that it was good, maybe, that Jesus went there. And so maybe if some of you are familiar with the King James version of this passage or other versions of this passage, a verse is added, right, that says, an angel of the Lord used to come and stir the waters up. Well, that's not found in the early manuscripts. It doesn't belong there. It was inserted later. And so more modern versions of the Bible have taken that verse back out, because it wasn't that. Now, some people think that it was, Asclepius or demonic forces that were causing this water to bubble. But there was a tradition that when the water bubbled, if you hopped in first, you were healed. Now, in reality, the pool of Bethesda is fed by springs. And at some point, the springs would just unleash, and that would cause the water to bubble. But the idea was if you were healed, if you were the first one in, you were healed. Now, that's not really fair to people who can't walk. And so Jesus, though, goes here and says, I know you are a people who are searching for healing. I know you are a people who are suffering, and I want you to know that I am the God who heals. I am the one who shows mercy. People, you can look for healing from Asclepius. You can look for it from the Greek gods. You can look for it anywhere, but I am the God of healing. And how foolish do we think these people are? That they would sit and they would wait for years to be healed by a God who doesn't exist. Really, to be healed by an idol. And yet, I think if we're honest and we open ourselves up, how many of us don't look for healing from idols? Now, idols, I don't think are evil things generally in our lives. I think idols are blessings that God has given us that we in turn place over God. Right? So when I say idol, it's not like you have a statue that you're hoping to that will heal you. But we have things in life that God has given us. How many of us don't look for healing in our work? If things are tough at home, if things are going wrong, some of us just will immerse ourselves in our jobs. Because it's in our jobs that we can escape. That the problems of our lives just kind of fade away and we think about what we're supposed to do for work. For some of us, our families, we go to for healing. Now, a close family is important, but sometimes we look for our healing from just those around us. Or friends, or maybe this one for me hits a little close to home, but sometimes it's recreation or exercise. That while itself is supposed to be therapeutic, can sometimes take a little bit too much of a priority in life. You see, sometimes we go through life and we invest so much into things, hoping that will heal us, that we forget to lean on Christ. We too are like the paralytic, sitting at the side of the pools of Bethesda, just hoping against hope that we will find meaning. And Christ says, you can find it in me. We look for healing in all kinds of places, from work to family to substances. We long to be healed. Christ says, come to me. But this passage also teaches us that hope is still alive. When we heard this passage read this morning, it's a line that goes by quickly, but he says he has been sitting there for 38 years. 38 years. He sat there day by day, waiting to be healed. I've eaten for 38 years. I've breathed for 38 years. I've done nothing else for 38 years. Can you imagine? This person had a sense of hopelessness. And some of you are there. This person had a sense of hopelessness. Think, if the Asclepion didn't work, the Asclepion would have gone out of business, right? Obviously, there were people who were experiencing healing there. And time again, somebody else got into the water and they were healed. Time and time again, somebody else was sick. Maybe it was their first time to the Asclepion and they got healed. Maybe it was somebody else who had been traveling that journey for a long time and they were healed. Maybe it was somebody who was relatively new and it's like, hey, you're not even from this town. Get away from my Asclepion. And they were healed. While this person watched and watched and watched. Eventually, he had to ask himself, why? Why do I look around and that I see all these other people being healed and I am not? Why? Some of us continue to ask that same question. Some of us have had an ailment for longer than 38 years. Some of us, maybe it hasn't been that long, but it sure seems just as hopeless. Unfortunately, what I'm not saying is that just keep hanging on and eventually God is going to answer your prayer in the way that you want it. What I am saying is that Christ comes. And even though sometimes it is a long wait, Christ is able to heal. Christ is able to restore. Christ is able to transform. And while it might not always look the way we want it, while we have our ideas of what healing looks like, Christ shows up. Even if for this man it was 38 years too long. And he heals. Also, this man had to feel lonely. We'll talk in a couple weeks about the power of communicative healing, but this man felt alone. All he needed was a friend to kick him into the pool when it started bubbling. But he walked, and in this case, he sat through this journey alone. His condition was obvious, and some of us have things that are obviously wrong in our lives, and other people know about it, and we can see it with our eyes. Others of us, though, harbor our diseases inside, and in doing so, we feel alone. Maybe we don't want people to know what's wrong. Maybe there's too much of that pride that's still left in us. Maybe we're embarrassed. Maybe we're just private. Regardless, we live alone, and we suffer alone. And what we long for is just a couple of people who would walk beside us and just give us a nudge. But this man was not alone, for Christ was with him. And I know sometimes talk is cheap, and I know that we have heard this 1,000 times, but we do not walk through our journey alone. The great healer is there. And finally, we learn that Christ is the new Asclepius. Or maybe I should say the new and improved Asclepius. What people had been longing for, and what people had been settling for, had been replaced with something real. He came to heal. This man could not walk, and he encountered Christ, and he could. He was healed. But Christ was more than healer that day, right? Christ was a healer of a world. Remember, I kept that last line in there, even though it doesn't really belong. It's the next story, because some people weren't happy with Jesus healing this man on this day, because it was the Sabbath. And Jesus restored the Sabbath. Not saying on a Sabbath anything goes, or forget the Sabbath, but rather taking care of each other is more important than the Sabbath. What Jesus said on that day is also, just like Asclepius was known for the snake and the resurrection, Jesus now says, I am the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. And I know sometimes it's hard to hold out hope, but Jesus says, and if we trust in him, that eventually one day we will be healed. Maybe not in this world, but in a world to come. For Christ is not only the king of this world, but he is king of a world to come. And so God gives us hope. But do you notice the irony here? Asclepius was a divine and human figure that the gods eventually killed because he was saving too many people. Jesus comes along, a divine and human being. God himself, who was killed by God so that everyone could be healed. He takes the Asclepian myth and says, people, you're close, but you have it wrong. God wants to transform. God wants to move. And that's true for you, it's true for me, and it's true for us. The miraculous power of Christ continues to move. But Christ calls us to follow him. Quit looking for other places. Christ alone heals. And while that healing may be exactly what you're looking for, or the type of healing Christ offers looks nothing like what your prayers consist of, he is the healer. I'll end with this. I so desperately want to stand in front of you and say, just keep believing in Jesus and you will be healed. But our congregation is living proof that we have called out to Christ, and he hasn't always come through in the way we've asked. And I don't want to cheapen it to say, well, just wait for heaven, although I believe that is 100% true. It's mysterious, and it's beautiful, and it's frustrating, and it's saddening, and it's angering. But somehow, when Christ is present, Christ heals. And my prayer for us this morning is that we can continue to be transformed from sin, from sickness, from death, through the great healer, not Asclepius, not whatever we look for, but Christ. For like the children and you helped us this morning said, he is the name above all names. He is the great transformer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Let us continue in worship this morning by offering our prayers to God.